Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is my privilege to be able to present this to you. I do wish we could all be in person, but alas, I know that's not always possible. But hopefully you can make it to one of our regionals or our annual conference, and we can get to know each other a little better and have more interaction at that point. So today we're talking about projects and budget forecasting. These two are connected in some ways. We're going to start with projects and talk through that, and then we're going to talk about budget forecasting. But before we jump in, let's talk holistically about what these two are. These two are two sides to a similar coin. The budget forecasting is when we are having the software look at our assets, look at condition and risk values, and do some forecasting, which means we're looking at the data and we're generating potential jobs that we should be doing based upon the criteria that's been entered into the system. So this is the computer looking and saying, based on data, here's what the data says, which is a very powerful tool that will allow us to do some things and work through our funding mechanisms with our commissioners or our boards, and when we're trying to seek funding for whatever projects we may be looking at doing. But that's only as good as the X's and O's that are in the computers and the numbers, and so it's going to generate just straight black and white answers. And as we all know, the world is not black and white. And so the power of projects allows you as an organization, with the expertise that your staff has, is to bring some real world qualification to what jobs and which assets we do work on. And so that's when I say the projects is kind of the other side of that coin. We let the computer tell us where everything should go, and then we take that data and then we tweak it and we say, okay, yeah, we're going to do that, but this one we're going to wait, this one we're going to move up, and we can use our local knowledge and our local understanding of our systems to tweak those to make them the way they should be. So as we get started, we're going to start with projects, and within that we start talking about jobs, because both of these interact with what we call jobs. Jobs are things we do to an asset. Now they're a little similar to a work order activity, but they are more specific to an asset type. They have specific costing that goes with that. It combines with attributes about the assets themselves. And so these jobs are used in both modules. So we want to start there, and that's really where, when you're building these out and you're going to use the full capability of these two modules, you want to start with managing jobs. And that's found under any of the asset classes that you may have. And when you see projects, you expand that and you're going to see managed jobs. I'm going to open that window and I'm going to maximize this to make it a little easier for everyone to see on their computers. So the first thing we're going to see is there's nothing here. Well, that's because we need to select a particular asset type, because each asset type can have its own jobs. Most typical is GIS assets, but we can also do the same thing for facility assets. In this example, I'm going to select the streets asset type from our transportation asset class. Once I've done that, now jobs that we've previously configured are showing up. So when you first come into this is going to be blank. So I'm going to walk through creating one of these after we've looked at one. So let's just pick the mill and overlay and the double click, so we're going to open up the window. This is where we're telling it what the job name is. So you get to decide. Pavement, mill and overlay is a common job, but if it's for sewer, it may be cured in place liners, it may be pipe bursting. For traffic signals, it may be equipment replacement, it may be pole replacement. You get to decide what the jobs are per the asset type. So this is just a free form control here. Then we can say whether it's comprehensive or a point. Big point of focus here, something to keep in mind. What is the definition of these and why is it important? First of all, when you're doing this, when we're talking about maybe a length of street or a length of pipe or an area with a polygon, when we use comprehensive, we're saying we're going to apply this job to the whole asset. So if it's a pipe that's 150 feet long, or a street segment that's 200 feet long, or an area that's 200 square feet, we're going to apply the unit cost to the entire area. So we're going to pave the whole street segment. We're going to replace the whole pipe. That's comprehensive. Point is when we're not going to do the entire thing. So point might be we're going to replace 10 feet on average for every 100 foot of pipe. So point repairs. You can estimate these by percentage of the hole. So 150 feet, and you say 10%, we're going to do 15 feet on average because we're estimating costs at this point. So point repair is when you're not doing the full asset, applying the job to the full asset. In this case, it's going to be comprehensive because when you mill and overlay, you're doing the entire road. Crack sealing might be a good example for one that might use point. Next, we're going to put in here our units of measure. Now, these units of measure don't impact calculations because we're going to use the map units or the information in the attributes, but this is for display purposes. So you understand this is per foot. A lot of times mill and overlay might be per square yard, and so you can put in a singular and plural. You can put in a unit cost. So this unit cost here is an estimating purposes, like engineering estimates. You want to wrap everything about that job, even if there's overhead or any other things, boil it down into a unit cost for estimating purposes. That can be set up then by a cost year. You may have information from previous jobs that have occurred in previous years and you want to use that as your basis. Then you just establish the cost year which that was applicable, and the system will appreciate and depreciate that value for depending on the year that it's applying, because we're going to be forecasting out multiple years. And then a description can be entered at your leisure. So when we add new, we're going to hit the plus button and we're going to add, and we're going to just populate all this information here as we just went through. This last button you see here is mapping of work orders, and this becomes important because when we're in projects, we're going to track estimated versus actual. And if this job, let's pick mill and overlay again, when we want to say we want to fire a work order based on this estimated job, we want it to create a work order with this detailed, this header information populated. So this is where you get to map that so that you can automatically create those work orders, that this is automatically populated from the system. And we'll see that a little later on. The next thing is classification fields. And by selecting the layer, which if there was multiple layers here, and there can be, you would select them one by one. What we're doing here is not every street is the same, and the costs are not going to always be the same for every street. So we want to give it two categories. So similar to risk and valuation in places where we're able to add subtypes, we can do the same here. So I am using this unit type as like a functional class, and the surface type would be like asphalt or concrete. And then our quantity, in this case, is our shape length. Now this quantity might be each or count. Double click on that. So if we go up here, we can pick count. If this is like a sign or a manhole, this would be in count instead of a measured length. Once we've established those, we can save those, and then we're going to move to job cost, because now we want to start establishing the cost within the system. So when we select mill and overlay, it's going to give us the combinations within the GIS of all the different unique combinations of the two different type fields. In this case, I apologize, this wasn't a functional class, but if this had been, you would see the different combinations here of all asphalt roads with the different functional classes. And here's where you can determine individual unit costs for each one. So maybe if I wanted to say cobblestone is going to be more expensive, we're going to edit that one and we're going to make that one 150. So you can set different unit costs for the different types of streets or different types of pipe or different types of whatever your assets are. Again, you can set the default year for each of these. So if you have different year cost estimates for these, you can use the different cost years. All right, we're going to update that. So when we update that, that's going to update the system, and we're going to use the unit cost, the cost year, the description, and we're going to synchronize with the attributes within the GIS. So by doing that, now, as you can see, what happened was I had changed the subtype. So now I see all the different combinations. As I said earlier, it was functional class. So now we have all these here, and I can change the values as I desire. Generally speaking, you can use one cost to make it simple, or you can dive down as detailed as you want to get, depending on how you want to set this up. Overhead. Overhead is where we're going to be able to add some of these in a project, such as mobilization, CEI. You see the different things we're doing. You have two options for the way you're going to set that up. You can either do it based on a % of the total or a fixed rate. So if you're typically doing a 5% for contingency or something like that, you can use a percentage. Or if there's just a, hey, we always charge $5,000 for contract administration, then you can just put that dollar figure in there. At this point now, you set up the jobs for this asset class. These are going to be available in both budget forecasting and projects. So I'm going to close this window now. And we're going to go back into projects now. I'm going to go into an existing project, and we're just going to start talking about how these jobs apply. By selecting Find Manage Report, we have our filter screen that we're used to for all the modules. We see the table view of the return values. I'm going to select this particular project, and then I'm going to maximize the window. This is our project screen. Now, there's a couple new things that have come out here in the recent past, more recent, that are enhancements to the project module. I wanted to cover them now so everybody understands. One of which is the configurable details control. So we've added the ability to establish unique forms similar to the work order forms on projects. So this form is tied to this project group, and it can be shared with other project groups. But you can create multiple different controls here, and as you can see, we've created some examples of different controls. If I go to a different one that is in a different project group, you're going to see we have different controls, and these are all totally set. Well, these actually may be the same now that I look at it, but you have the ability to set different types for different project groups. So how did we do that? Let's put a hold right now on this page, and let's go into the administer settings, because that's where we're going to see where we did that. I'm going to minimize that for a moment. We're going to scroll down here to administer settings. We're going to maximize that to make it easier to see. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to see form layout. So this is very similar to how you're used to seeing it in service requests and work orders. And as you can see, we have our existing form, VUEWorks default. If I preview, it's very basic with just a simple notes field. But you can create as many as you need using the tools below in editing. So for example, the one we just saw, we built that. And we have a different one for a different group. These are all built using the editing tool. So if we hit the edit button down here, you're going to see the interface. Now this one is very similar to the service request module, not so much as the work order, but the service request module has it where you have to add a field first by selecting edit fields. This is where you create the control. So you can see we've created all these. So this is an email address, a wide text input. Let's see if we have anything else. Narrow text input, 2 choice options. Once they're in here, then they can be applied to any control, any form. So we just simply go to add. We select the choice like date selector. We give it a name. And now it's available. Now it does say undefined, but when we close and come back in, you'll see that it provides that name. And where did it go? It's your date at the bottom, right here. So we're going to close that. So now if we were wanting to add that to this control, now we can select that. It's available in our drop down. We can select the button to add it to the control, and we can select the location for it to drop into. Very similar to the service request form view. So I'm going to close that because I don't want to save that. Oops. So the next question then is, how do we know which one's going to show up? Well, this goes to the second enhancement that's occurred in the last couple of months, and that's in the management of project groups. We now have a tab that allows us to manage project groups, to control them and edit them. We can see how many times, how many projects are within each one. If there are none, we can actually delete the project group. If there are projects, then you're prevented from deleting them, as that would mess with the projects that are under them. And you can rename them, you can edit them, as you can see here. The way we then create new projects is going to allow us to pick the project group it comes under and the form we're going to use. So let's go do that now. So that's the two places, groups and form layout, that is different than what's been in there before. The rest of this is if we're creating pick lists in the form, it's very similar to the other modules. We create the list and then we create the items within the list by following the add and populate the information. And then they will be available when you're creating a control on the form layout. So now let's go back in here and let's go to add project to see how we would apply those things we've done. So here's a tip, before you create a project, you must have a project group previously created that you want to put it in. So going back, if I were to I'm going to call these demo projects. So I would come into the groups section, add, we'll call it webinar. That has to be done first before you go to add a new project. So we can add to any of these groups, but it has to be here first before you could populate that when you created the project. Let's go to add project. You're going to see a new interface here. So I'm allowed to put the title in here, and this is going to be here's where we get to select from the available project groups. So I'm going to select my project group, and then I'm going to select the project form. So from those three we had available to us, I'm going to randomly pick the waste haulers. And now this is what we're saying. We're creating this project. It's going to be in this group using this form. And that will then launch our interface that we're all used to. That drives this form and it puts it into this project. Okay, so let's go back to table view because I want to now go back to an existing project. And we're going to go here. So that's the creation of it. And two of those two features that are fairly new to people if they haven't been involved in projects here in the last couple of months. And it has added some more functionality to the projects module. Within the projects module, we have a couple areas we can manage and put information in. Starting in the header, we can create a location. This can be just any kind of location, maybe a subdivision or maybe a part of the city, or as this says, county-wide. Over on the right, we can set estimated and actual start and end dates. This can be used for any kind of things. This could be just fiscal years for estimated, and then putting your actual dates in here. Some people will use projects to help manage permits. So this may be in the water world and sewer world, there's permits for industrial pretreatment that sometimes you have to manage other areas that are permits, and you're tracking work that's done related to that. You can actually set your estimated start end dates and then be able to report on that to know when permits are about to come due. We can populate obviously any of the controls in the details tab. But here's where the power of projects really comes in. And when we're looking at estimated costs, now we can use projects just as a bucket to put work orders in for insurance claims and things like that. Those would fall under actual costs. But to really use the power, this is where we're going to start using those jobs we created in the earlier steps and apply them here. So here's our overall summary. So we have assets, and you're going to see a line for every asset type that you may have. You can combine multiple asset types here. Streets, signs, culverts, valves, manholes, whatever you need to put into a project, you can combine them. You're going to see the totals for each individual one. And then you're going to see your overhead. So you can see that broken out. And that totals up to your estimated cost. To see how these are all calculated, we're going to go to the job details. So part of the thing you're going to see here is each line item is an individual asset with information from the GIS about its location, the two classification fields, what type of job, what specific job, the unit costs that are established for them. And if you see that number is different than what we'd have because it's using the cost year. That was a 2012 cost year, and now that's been inflated for inflation, so you can see that that cost has been calculated to be higher. The quantity is reading from the GIS, giving you a total cost for that particular segment, and then it rolls up to the total for all of them. So how do we add these? When we go to add a job, we have two options. We can add a job with assets and we can add a job without assets. So typically we're going to be wanting to do it with assets because that's how we're going to use the strength of the GIS and the mapping that we have and the assets that we're wanting to include. So if we select the asset class, in this case it's going to be transportation, we're going to select the asset type, streets, and then the job type. So again, going back to comprehensive or point. If we pick point, we're only going to have the one that was a point job type. So it's going to only let you pick the jobs that have this setting right. So this is a hierarchical setup here. Let's go into comprehensive. You see I have a different subset. So if we add slurry seal, now we're ready to say, okay, how are we going to calculate this? So using field map quantities means we're going to use 100% of the extent. So meaning in this case it's comprehensive, we're going to use 100% of whatever quantities are in the system. We could say 50% if you only wanted to do 50%. You can set that. Now, most typically it's left at 100% for what we're doing here because it's comprehensive. If we wanted to set some default quantities, then we can set that as well. Maybe you're only going to do 100 feet of every particular asset or whatever that may be. You can set that here. We can add a default description if we want. Now we need to tell it which assets are we going to do these jobs to. So we have two options. We can do it from the map or from the current selection. So what I typically do is I typically go and I grab the assets that are in question by any number of ways using GIS filtering, visually selecting on the map, and I put them into my selection set ahead of time so I can take my time, get it right, pull some out, put some in, and that's typically what I do. But in this case, I'm going to use the from the map, and we're going to select some assets. So it's going to jump us to the map, and it's our typical selection tool we're used to seeing. I'm going to select the layer, in this case streets, and I'm just going to select a couple streets just by dragging a box. Okay, that's giving us 14. I can look and see, okay, these look, oh, wait a minute, I didn't mean to have this one. I can remove that one. So I have the ability to kind of QA/QC what I've selected, add some more, remove. I can use the different tools up here to do that. And another function that is new to our newest build is our selection type. So if those who haven't upgraded, you're going to get to be able to use boxes, fences, drawing, or circles. So I'll take a moment here. This isn't projects and budgets, but it's a really cool feature I think everybody should be able to see. So a fence is where, zoom out a little bit. You got to stop moving the mouse and click. And it just keeps building your fence. When you're done, you double click and it grabs what's inside it. Draw is more free form. I just hold I right click, hold the mouse button down and wait and then let go. And I can select within that. Circle is as it sounds. You start with a point. Actually, you click and hold, I apologize, and drag your circle that selects the assets. So that's the different types that are now available. Once we've selected what we want, we select done. And let's check cost again. Oh, that's not good. 27 of these are not included. I must have had something in there wrong. But one that's important is check. So you want to make sure you have information that it can calculate the cost. So it needs those fields that are in question. It needs the length or whatever value you're using to calculate quantities, things like that. So it's going to show you that how many do we have altogether? 27. So some of these are missing. I'm going to see how many it actually adds. When you're done, they have to have cost information. You select OK. That brings the jobs in at that point. So they all must have a classification 1, a classification 2, and the units, the quantities, or it can't do the calculation. So it will prompt you when you don't have the right information. Another thing I want to point out though is sometimes we want to add a job that doesn't have an asset, right? So maybe we're talking about a building and we're going to rehab the whole building and we just want to throw a number at it, right? So let's talk about facilities and maybe facility. So we're going to do facilities. That's where I had it configured, comprehensive, and we're going to rehabilitate. Thank you. And now we're updated. Select OK. Now we should have, there we go. It says asset does not exist because we didn't want to select one, but we have the cost added in. So you have a couple ways of handling things that are not asset driven, but you want included in the project. Okay, so now that we have all of our jobs in here, we have the ability to affect our actual costs. So actual costs are work orders that we may do. So now let's think about a project. Your staff may be doing this, which is easy to understand. We have our staff do work orders. We track our labor, equipment, and our inventory, and we track the whole cost of that, and that applies here. But sometimes these are contracted projects. And so you can daily have your inspectors go out and complete work orders to track that, or maybe you once a month, after you reviewed the periodic payment estimate for that contractor, you select the assets that that contractor worked on that month, and you bring in the total cost, and you create a work order, add in the cost and other, and I think you'll be able to see an example here. So under costs, we brought in from the vendor $59,446. So that could be a work order that is a periodic payment estimate, so you're tracking the actual costs. You can actually associate assets, which we have only one here, but you could have multiple assets here for all the assets that were completed, worked on that month under that periodic payment estimate. Once we've done that, now these are all going to continue to total up to give you your actual cost. This will help track the over or under run for the project during its process. Another way to do this is if you want to add a work order directly from one of these jobs, scroll down here, and I click Edit, Confirm the Creation. Now, if you remember that mapping component that we talked about earlier on the job, we would select the asset. I'm just going to hit Done because we need a point. This set up the appropriate structure that we had set up in the mapping component. The asset is attached from that job, and now we're ready to go, and we can assign this to whomever, and we can send this off to be done, and then we can start tracking that. It will show up in actuals at this point. You see it's associated to the project automatically when I hit save. Now I do need to refresh my page, so I'm going to move over one and come back. Go into actual costs. There's the one we just created. So you can create work orders straight from a work order and associate to a project, or from the project and launch the work order. Couple tips here. This is a great place to keep track of some just overall information about your projects. As I said, you can configure these to have whatever forms you want. This is totally at your leisure. This is your canvas. One thing that people often overlook on projects is, hey, let's link the documents to this. So we're going to have contract documents. We're going to have construction drawings, as-built. Even when the project's over, you're going to have contract wrap-up documents. This is a great place to keep that, because 10 years from now, when you're trying to figure out where's that document, where's those as-builts, you can come here and find this project, even though it's closed, and access those drawings. So a great place to keep track for others to be able to come find information about that project, not only while it's operating, but even in the future once it's been closed out. And then, like we've seen before, comments. These are a running list with the username, date, and time. A good way to have communication within your team and have that documented within the system. So that's projects at a whole, and I know we're probably going to have some questions on that I'll want to approach when we get to the end of this. I'm going to now shift into the budget forecasting. When we go into budget forecasting, now we're looking at letting the system to use the information that's been populated in this system to tell us where we should do work. So as you saw, we were telling those projects which assets we wanted to do work on. Now we're going to let the system tell us where we should do work and what we should do. So a couple things before we get started in budget forecasting. I'm going to show administrator settings that you have to set up ahead of time so that it's easy to understand and make sure, because budget forecasting is not something you do daily. So having this set up ahead of time helps, because it can get frustrating when you're trying to run it, something's not working. First thing we want to do is we want to set up a couple things. Once this loads, we're going to see we have a couple tabs across here that we need to do. We want to pick the asset type. Now, typically our life expectancies are shared. This information is shared across risk and valuation and also budget forecasting. So this is oftentimes already populated because you may have done it for other areas, but if it hasn't, we can populate it here. And this is where we're using the two different subtypes, like we talked about before, and its install year. We can then configure unique years of life expected based on these combinations. We can select our deterioration curve. So let's talk about deterioration curve for just a moment. This is what we're using to forecast what the condition of an asset's going to be in the future. We know based on the latest condition what it is now, but what we don't know is how it's going to perform, and we need to have the system be able to project that. So we use deterioration curves. There are a lot of standard curves out there, and we come out of the box with the top four you see here. For asphalt, typically fourth order polynomial is very commonly used if a custom curve is not used. Sometimes concrete uses third order polynomials. Again, you get to drive which one you want to use. But hey, maybe you've had an engineer come in, maybe you guys have done a lot of work. You know what your specific deterioration curve is in your city, county, or DOT, your organization, and you want to use your own curve. So by select, you can create a custom curve, which is simply an XY plot. And what that's saying is, no matter what the life expectancy of it is, when it's brand new, it starts at 100 and it's going to start dropping. This custom curve started at 4, I think. And when it's used up its expected life, it's going to be at a 0. So if it's 35, then this is a percentage of that 35. So 100 is year 35, 0 is year 1. So no matter what it is, if it's 20 years, this curve will then shrink or expand based on its expected life. So we're going to select which one of these we want to use when we're doing the budget forecast. So you get to pick from them whichever one you want to use. Baseline, this is very important. Your system's not going to run without a baseline. What the baseline means is we want to go ahead and create all the records for what, if we don't do anything to these assets, how are they going to deteriorate based on what we have today. So in this case, you would select whichever assets are going to be in here and you run calculate now. This is going to allow the system to know kind of the steady state of where we are now projected out so that we can compare when we're applying jobs to those and see how that compares. Once you're done, you're going to see the results of the 10 years. Now, let's go back. If you're running more than a 10-year, we need to set that life expectancy. So, but right now it's going to run on a 10-year. If we want to change that, if we're running a 15, 20, 50, 100-year, you need to change the time span to the number of years. So it's very important that your budget forecast not run longer than your baseline was calculated for. By default, it comes in at 10 years. Job assignment. So you can set this up now here, or you can set this up for each budget forecast scenario you run. I recommend you do this here first and then override it. It just makes the entry a little easier because now this is available for every scenario you run with this asset type instead of having to do it each time you create a new scenario. So what we're doing here is we're saying, based on its condition score, if it falls between a 66 and a 75, we're going to do a slurry seal. And we're going to do 100% of it because it's a comprehensive job. We're going to either add value or change the actual value. So if we want to say, so whatever the score was, it's now going to become an 80. We could say whatever the score is, we want to add 5 points. That's where you would add the value here. Then we want to talk about what are we doing to the life expectancy. So we're either resetting the install year if we do a full reconstruction, or we are going to add a specific number of years based on the job we're doing. This is where you set that up. And I'll open one up so you can see what the interface looks like. You establish the low end of the spectrum, the high end of the spectrum, the job. When you're comprehensive, you want 100%. If you use a default value, you can set that for point repairs or whatever you need. And then the post D curve values, this is where we add value or actual value, and we can set the number of years added. That's with failure mode criteria. Deterioration criteria is the same setup. We can set these up differently as well. And you'll see when we get in there how these apply. Project jobs are going to come in the same. We're going to be able to set these up. We can set up the add value, the actual values, years added, things of that nature here as well. And then if you want to get specific, you can add in the different funding sources and job associations related to those. So when you do a job, where's the funding source for it? So these are all the different jobs that are in here based on this asset type, and where's the funding code? Once we've done that, we can save that and close. I'm not going to save any of the changes I made. So now you're ready to jump in and start creating a budget forecast. So I'm going to go into an existing one and we're going to walk through the wizard real quick. So I'm going to select this one. So when we first walk in, this is the form we're going to see. We're going to see this was a 5-year project, I believe. 6 years, actually, I apologize, 6 years. And you see the years, you see the baseline, which we calculated earlier, we talked about, and what the results were. And then we're going to see, once we run the forecast, you're going to see the resulting information. So this one was dropping from a 55 average deterioration, average condition score, to a 40 if we don't do anything. Whereas with this scenario, we're going to be able to change that value from an average of 55 to 72 over 6 years. And here's the budgets that are required each year and using the different funding sources. So how do we do this, right? Let's jump into a wizard. We built this wizard to make it easier to remember when we're doing this maybe annually because it's for our capital projects. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to name the scenario and add a little description. And then we can look at a couple things down here at the bottom. The most common is this first button, automated budget forecast, where the system picks the assets and the jobs based on the criteria you've established. There are other options here where you can be more specific, but 95% of what people are using is going to be this first step here. By selecting next, now we get to tell it which asset types. So we just put the addition button. We're going to add in whatever asset types we want. If we have more than one, we can prioritize or not based on the order here and the weighting. So you can wait. So let's just add, I'm not going to run this, but we can add in just to show the example. So maybe we want to weight the streets 3-to-1. So I mean, 75% of our money we want to spend on streets and 25% on sidewalks, right? So we're still not going to prioritize by asset type because we don't want to jump one or the other. We don't want sidewalks to come before streets, but we do want to say 75% is going to go into streets, 25 into sidewalks. So you can use the weighting there to establish that. This is using step 3A is saying, where are the assets coming from? Well, in this case, we're using our entire system, but maybe you only want to do a section of your system. So you can create a selection set, have that in your selection set currently, and you can use the current selection set. So you can run a budget forecast on a subsection of your town or county or state. Especially good with DOTs where you're allowed to do, you can do districts or regions, which is oftentimes needed with the way the setups are there. Step 4, we're going to pick near and long-term criteria. So what do these mean? Near term, we have a little better idea how things perform in the first about 5 years. After that, we're using some educated guessing to know because we understand we can see the next couple of years, but beyond that, we're getting a less accurate just by the basis of time. So you can use different criteria for the first 5 years. Maybe you're going to use risk score or an influencing failure mode probability. So for example, why is the road a certain score? The stress that created it, the defect that created that score, the influencing one, is the one that's going to help us prioritize. So we can use some of those tools. One key note to see here, when we talk about deterioration curve value, we're really talking about the condition score. Because when the first year, we're looking at the current condition, and then we're projecting that over the curve that we talked about, the deterioration curve. So when you think deterioration curve, you're thinking condition score. One note here, percent life used. If you have good actual percent life data in your GIS, install year data in the GIS, then this is a good function to use here. If, however, you have back calculated that based on a a condition run, maybe you did some evaluation of your system and you used a table to back calculate what that would be based on the deterioration curve, you don't want to have this selected here. You actually just want to leave that blank potentially, or use another factor. Because those numbers are not actual, you don't want to use those in the system. Just a little note there to keep in mind. This checkbox here is important. Why is it important? Well, as we talk about where our money is best spent, when we're on that deterioration curve, if we're higher up on it, we spend less dollars to maintain our roads at a higher level than if we let them fail and have to totally rebuild them. So what this is going to do is just say, I'm going to spend my money on the jobs that are in the criteria, but I'm going to spend more money and I'm going to prioritize on those higher jobs that keep my good roads good and allow those that are lower to go ahead and fail, so that we can end up using more preventative type instead of reactive type work, as that is less costly overall to the organization. If that's what you want to do, then check this box and that's what's going to happen. Step 5, this is those jobs we talked about. If you remember, we had the 2 types, failure modes and the other. So in this case, near term would be using these jobs and this criteria. Long term would be using these jobs and these criteria. So again, because we created those in manage jobs and in the administer settings, we didn't have to redo that each time we did it. They automatically came in. However, if we need to edit for this particular scenario, we can edit that information here. If you have multiple asset types, you simply select the different ones. We don't have anything configured for this, but you would see you could control them separately. So you select the different asset types. Next step, deterioration curves. So streets, what we're talking about here is an average. If we want to say we're trying to get our system, overall system, to a 78, then we set that under average. Minimum means once we've met that criteria and we've got our system to a 78, I want to spend the rest of my budget on anything that has still in a condition of less than 20. So that's where the minimums are. And you can see those lines line up here. If I pick on the sidewalks, you're going to see a different curve, which I probably haven't even set up a curve for that, so which is why we don't see it there. So if you're wanting to say, I've got a budget, I want to see what my resulting condition is, you may want to let this be 100 so that you spend all your money and you don't stop spending because you've met the criteria. If you're doing a budget where you're trying to figure out how much it's going to cost to get your roads or your assets to a particular score, then you want to set that average. So that's where that really comes into play, depending on how you're looking at your scenarios. Step 7 is we're talking about our budgets now, right? So we can set the first year of the scenario. So in this case, I've set 2019, but you can set it for 2020. You can set it whatever you need. You can set the annual budget. In this case is a pretty big one for all the roads we have in here. And then whether you want to apply an inflation rate to that budget. I don't know about you guys, but when I was working in a municipal government, I never got inflation rates to my budget. So I typically probably wouldn't use that because my numbers were pretty stagnant. But if you get that regular upgrades to your budgets, then that may be another thing to apply. You can set the number of years, and then when you apply that, you're going to get this information. Breakdowns, this is important. Oftentimes your funding comes from different sources, so you can break down your percentages based on different funding sources and use a percentage here, or you can do it by the asset type. If I say, you know, I hadn't prioritized the weighting earlier, but I want to spend 75% of my money on streets, 25 on sidewalks, you can select the different asset types. Or if you say jobs, I want to spend most of my money on mill and overlay and the rest on crack sealing, you can set that here as well. Or even set amounts rather than percentage. If you do that here, where we set, that's going to apply that same value to all years. If you want to change that by year, you can do them individually here. This is going to set it for only that 1 year. So once we've done that, we're going to save that and we're going to go, I'm not in this case, but you would save that and you go to the run page. We can see this would be blank at the moment. And when we run the scenario, it'll spin and it's going to return this information. Here's your summary information for this scenario. It's the same you're going to see on the other page we were on. And you see the information. We want to see information about the jobs that built that information. We can filter by the year. So if I want to look at 2020, apply that. I'm going to get different jobs. These are 2020 ones. If I want to go to 2023, we see we have 2023 year and the different jobs that are going to apply. You can export this to Excel. You can add the assets that are in these sections to your selection set, so you can then create a project from them, things of that nature. So I'm going to go ahead and save at this point, or just close this. Once we've run that, this gets updated. We can add any documents, the basis of what we did. We can control, look at our budgets and estimates there. We can look at an audit if there was any jobs. So you see we had some assets missing data. Out of the 16,000, we had 1,000 roughly that were missing data. So a good way to see, is my GIS fully populated, to help me know if this is a very accurate or inaccurate scenario. So these tips and considerations come from someone who has banged my head against a wall too many times running through some of these modules because things just aren't working, and I think I've done everything right, only to realize I missed one little thing somewhere. These are complex. They are powerful tools. And so some of these tips and considerations are just learned from, well, doing things the wrong way the first time. So with projects, especially with the new tools that we have, make sure before you're adding that you've got the project group and the details tab form created before you go to add that new. That's a change, because it used to be you could add that when you're adding the project group. Second one, comprehensive versus point. That just confused me for the longest time as a client. And so when I realized, kind of got to the understanding of, when we're using points, we're not doing the whole project. When we're using comprehensive, we're doing the whole asset. That was a big eye-opener for me. I did not use the documents tab as much as I should have. And when I finally started using that, and the rest of my team was understanding, hey, I can go, this can be my source of finding information. If you can start that in your organization and continue to use that, then this really becomes that much easier to go find information rather than going to the map room and sorting through a bunch of paper flat files. It's much easier to go and find that information. So oftentimes we don't have install years, and we can help our clients back calculate those if they are really truly a good value, meaning you've actually done your homework and looked at when this subdivision was built, or we have some records and found that, then we use it. If we back calculated it, we don't want that to skew the information, so we want to leave that out. Again, the prioritizing assets, this is a really big deal. Anybody just looking at how we're going to use our money wisely when we're talking about asset management, the goal is to be doing preventative maintenance first. It's much cheaper in the long run to maintain our assets rather than having them fail and having to rebuild them. So that selection tool is important for making sure the system is evaluating it the way you want it to evaluate it. And then the breakdown. The breakdown is really helpful when you're using multiple assets or multiple funding sources and things like that. So you can use that to specify how your money is spent within the scenario to give you that really good feedback for what you're looking for. Thank you all for joining us today. It's been my privilege to present this to you, and please reach out with any questions. We'll be happy to answer them.